Okay, so welcome to our panel, and really, we've been talking as a group. We couldn't be more impressed with the turnout. It's hard sometimes to compete with congressmen, and sometimes when you put the word training and education into the title of a gathering, you generally don't have people beating down the door. So we couldn't be more impressed. You know, the topic for the panel is developing the cyber workforce. And what I will tell you is this: as a panel, we certainly feel we speak from we come from very different perspectives, but we all are in almost violent agreement that there's probably no more important a topic. And I was very gratified to hear General Nakasoni's remarks. He led off with that we wanted to have capability. We want to have those super empowered individuals. And even though a little bit later on we heard from the esteemed David Brumley, and it sounded as if he was initially saying that we just need to turn this over to make fully autonomous systems. As you listen to his remarks, you really heard him say very strongly that yes, we need the best capabilities, but that we need to have the most highly trained, the most well-educated individuals that are using those power tools. So in that way, here's the rules of engagement for this panel. We decided we want to do this not in a traditional panel format. We're not sitting behind tables with table tents, which generally devolves into a series of monologues, and then there's 5 minutes at the end for questions. We're going to try to turn that on its head. We've got, we better part of another hour and 15 minutes together. We want to have a dialogue amongst ourselves, but most importantly, we want to engage you in dialogue to talk about what we all consider to be, frankly, the most critically important topic out there. Technology alone will not save us. We all know that. Technology is going to be an important part of this future nutritious breakfast. But we have to have well-trained, highly educated folks that are going to make the difference downrange. We also talked as a group about how there's a lot of philosophy that we could share with you, and we all have been down many different paths and have developed our own philosophy about how we can best do this. But we're going to try wherever possible to focus on best practices. So share with you things that we've seen in our experiences that have allowed us to attract, to inspire, to develop highly talented cyber individuals. So the way it's going to go is we're going to take, like I said, 3 or 5 minutes or so, giving our own perspective, kind of tell each. I'm going to ask each of them. You all have their bios. I'm not going to read them to you. They're going to tell you a little bit about themselves, and then they're going to give you their perspective, and then we're going to go to the questions. We have developed as a group 5 or 6 or so questions, but we want very much not to wait to the end. If you have a question, particularly about anything we've said, stick up your hand. We all, I think, can agree that that will make for a more interesting panel. So that's the rules of engagement. Just a little bit of background on where I'm coming from my perspective. So I had the good fortune to spend 30 years in the Army, about half of that at West Point, focused on cybersecurity and cybersecurity education. And it's in that context that I got an appreciation for, I believe, some of the things that could inspire, some of the things that could motivate, some of the things that help develop young talent with respect to acquiring the knowledge and skills that can be necessary for them to be effective cyber operators. Some of which you heard about. So the cyber stakes that David Brumley and crew we were so fortunate to have continued to execute. That was an initiative that I put in place when I was a DARPA program manager. I went to the director of DARPA and said, look, this is what we need. It's going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference because we're going to give young people the opportunity to do hands-on. And that's another theme that I think is going to has made and will continue to make the difference. You could hear the excitement in David Brumley's voice when he talked about what he's done and what his students are doing. That excitement occurs in the context of being able to do. And it's those that can do that are going to want to do more. So a theme that I have seen throughout my time with cybersecurity education and training is, hands-on, crucially important. The ability to do ensures that they truly understand it at a deep level. And it's on that foundation, and again, we're going back to David Brumley, that says you can't have true creativity unless you have a basis upon which to be creative. And the final point I want to make is, in my many years in higher education, and that's what I'm here for. So while I was an Army colonel, my perspective for this panel is as somebody that's involved in higher education. One of the things you get from higher education, we're not going to supply the whole workforce. The numbers out there are crazy. The NIST CyberSeek initiatives says there's over 1 million+ jobs out there in the U.S. in cybersecurity. A full quarter of those are unfilled. And I think you'll find very few professions where those kind of numbers exist. And then another study, and this may be a little overstated, basically said by the year 2022, there'll be more cybersecurity unfilled jobs than there are molecules in the universe.
Might be a little
okay, well, maybe that's a little overstated, but you get the idea. All right, so with that in mind, what you get, well, higher education is not going to be the whole solution. What you will get is individuals that have gone through that sort of experience, and they have acquired critical thinking skills, and they've acquired problem-solving skills. And more than anything, when it comes right down to it, those are the kind of individuals that we want to be part of, not exclusively part of this cybersecurity and cyber operations workforce. So, Paul?
Sir, appreciate it. My name is Colonel Paul Stanton. I have the honor and privilege of commanding the Cyber Protection Brigade. And as the only currently uniformed person on the stage, I do understand commander's intent and the ability to execute mission command. And although I lack the same enthusiasm as my friend and mentor, Colonel Dr. Ragsdale, I will try to bring some energy to the panel. I will not tackle a mascot in the room later today. I can assure you that.
Good. That's a good plan. Okay.
I have lots of scar tissue. I have had the privilege of serving within Army Cyber since about 10 months after its inception. I've watched this thing from the beginning. I've worked in capabilities development. I've worked in education. I had the opportunity to teach at West Point for a little bit. And now in my seat down at Fort Gordon, Georgia, with the 20 active duty cyber protection teams for Army Cyber, I see it from the operational standpoint. If I had to circle all the way back to say, what is the one thing that we bring in this $7 billion industry of cybersecurity, how on earth are we as the Army going to recruit and retain the talent that we know we need in order to accomplish this mission? It's just that. We have the mission. And what keeps folks engaged is just what Rags was saying. The ability to do. Having a mission that is relevant to the workforce is absolutely essential to the talent. But then you have to create the environment that allows them to train, rehearse, and then conduct operations. And that's non-trivial in these early days. And it's also not static. It changes continuously. And if you flip back through doctrinal manuals and you go to training and doctrine for the Army, the Training and Doctrine Command, and you look for the policies and procedures to remain agile, to evolve continuously, that's not how we have operated in the past. But it's absolutely essential to how we have to operate in the future. So I'll hand over the mic. My principal talking point is being able to keep folks on mission and provide them with an environment that allows them to train and rehearse in order to perform that mission. Absolutely essential components.
Thank you. Alan, please.
I'm Alan Paller. I'm the Director of Research at SANS, but I actually started SANS about 3 weeks after the Morris worm to try to create a workforce that would be able to respond to the clearly expanding problem that we were going to face. But the last 5 years, I've been focused on only one problem, and it is the problem of creating new cyber warriors. So what we figured out at SANS is that our job has always been to help people who are already in the field get better. They might have been a forensics person, but now they're going to do Macs, and now they're going to do iPhones, and now they're going to do Android, but that's not starting. So we could always assume that they had some base of knowledge. So everything we did was based on that. But I want to stop for 1 second. There are about 20 empty seats here in front, and there's lots of space. It's not like everybody's crowded. So come on up, and there are about 15 or 8 or so over here. This is SANS because we're always running conferences, so I count seats. So anyway, there's lots of seats, so please do come up and use them just for comfort. So, but I've been focused only for the last 5 years on this issue of creating the pipeline. And the reason I did, in almost no audience do I get to say this explicitly, but in this audience you get it because you actually heard it this morning. The worry is not, can we protect our PCs and our health records? That's really important. The worry is that we dominate kinetic weapons. Just, we're a whole lot better than everybody else. The other side has been, well, whoever the other side is, not the enemy, the other side has been spending much of its money, a lot of its money, taking command and control of our weaponry. They are outspending us 4-to-1 in that area. And it turns out, and the Colonel and I were talking about this, it turns out that in the other, there are 2 areas I care about, our weapon systems and our power systems. There's lots more to worry about, but that's what I'm focused on. Do we have the manpower to protect those systems? It turns out that a guy named Mike Asante, who some of you know, he's sort of the nation's top guy in power systems. He was a chief security officer at NERC, chief security officer at American Electric Power. He was the guy who found the Aurora vulnerability that might have been used in some centrifuge thing. So he really knows this stuff, and he was our team leader for the United States that went over to the Ukraine after the attack. And when he came back, I sat him down and I said, okay, what do we really know? And he says, manpower. And this isn't saying it to me because I wanted to hear it. He says, there is no weaponry, no automated systems that we will be able to put in place that can respond to the kinds of attacks that are going after our power systems. And David Brumley's right. We need all that stuff he's talking about, but we also need people who can use it and respond in real time. So if you care about who owns our weapons and if you care about having the lights on, then you care about people. That's where the focus has been. So the first thing I did, and I'll just stop with the problem. I'll define the problem and tell you there are solutions that other people have found, is we found the 3 barriers that keep cybersecurity manpower from happening at the level that we need it to. One is the wall. Alan Parrish at the Naval Academy calls it the wall. You get kids into cybersecurity classes, you try to teach them how to do something, they don't have anatomy. Think of them as doctors who've never studied anatomy. You cannot teach them how to do secure coding if they've never written a program. You cannot teach them how to secure a Linux box if they don't have an idea what VI is. I mean, there's just so much to the world. So one is the wall. 2 is, whom do we train? We're getting a whole lot of people in to this field who shouldn't be there. But we haven't a priori been able to say, you shouldn't be here, go do something else. So we let everybody in, and then they slow it all down. And the third one, which I think is the most fun one, is how do we get the kids to engage and get excited so that we feed that through? You can ask questions about this, but I'll just give you what we found in the last 5 years. The Brits have figured out how to test people so that they know a priori there are 3 quadrants, whether you're somebody who's going to be successful no matter what they do, which is all we're really getting out of our schools, people who came in able to do it and they come out able to do it. But if you're somebody who, if we trained you, if we could get you over the wall, you would be good, versus somebody, if we tried to train you, you would fail. And they've got, if you want to read all about this, it's the Cyber Retraining Academy. They took psychiatrist, journalist, bartender, cop, and 47 other people. And they started from scratch. They tested them so they knew they were able to do it. That's their test. And all 51 of them are now working in cool cybersecurity jobs, and their bosses think they're great. And that's 9 months later after they started the recruiting. So they have figured out how to test them. They also figured out how to take people over the wall. It turns out that the wall happens because nobody taught them anatomy. And if you want proof of that, a lot of you know Brian Krebs. How many of you know Brian Krebs? Quarter. He's the top journalist in the field, so you probably read him. Anyway, he just did an article about 2 months ago about why Russia has so many of these people. it turns out, people who can really do cyber at high levels, it turns out that since 1985, they've been teaching anatomy. So that 70,000 kids every year for at least the last decade have been tested on the things you need to know so you can succeed in cybersecurity. So the Brits actually combined those two into their cyber academies, finding people with talent and then getting over. And I said, if you Google Retraining Academy, there's a lot on it. The last one is the kids. The UAE found the solution to this one. It's called CyberStart. 7 governors actually tried it this summer, 7 US governors. But what they discovered was if you don't try to teach people cybersecurity, but do you remember what David said? You give them a little problem, you let them solve it, you give them a bigger problem, let them solve it. They built a game that gives them problem after problem after problem, and it separates the people who really are excited about this from the ones who aren't. And the governors announced it on July 14th. By July 29th, there were 3,400 kids playing it with no advertising. So there's a hunger. They're really good. So those are my 3. You need to know how to get them over the wall. You need to know whom you want to get over the wall, right? You don't want to do it. By the way, in the UAE, they use the same test. And because it's the UAE, I hope I don't have any of you here. Anyway, because it's the UAE, certain people got into the class who you might not have picked. And the 4 that were in the lower quadrant failed. So I love tests like that actually tell you that they've got negatives and they can tell you where the line is. Kind of cool stuff. So the test, the getting over the wall, and a game that actually lets kids get excited about it and prove that they're good, and on to you.
Okay.
Thank you, Alan. Nick, please.
Yeah. So I'm Nick Percoco. I am the Chief Security Officer at a startup in Chicago called Uptake. And I've been there for about a year and a half, but my cybersecurity career spans a little more than 20 years. And going back to where I started in cybersecurity, I started in the 90s as a pen tester, ethical hacker at a company known as Internet Security Systems, and was doing security research there. And then graduated to actually ended up building teams of hackers and security researchers. I helped found a company called TrustWave, and ran Spider Labs there for about 11 years. And so when I think about the problem of trying to build cybersecurity workforce, some of the tactics that I applied or even what I'm doing today, but even back when I was building Spider Labs, were a little bit unconventional. I operate a bit in the hacker community. I run a hacker conference in Chicago known as ThoughtCon, and I had needs. As someone who was building a cybersecurity business, I had to find people to fit certain roles. I had to find certain skill sets, and I would fly all over the world and go to hacker conferences. I'd go to conferences in Europe, I'd go to conferences in Latin America and Asia and all over the US, and I would sit in the room and look at the agenda and say, I need some skills that are in wireless. I need some skills in application, code review or hacking. And I would go and sit in the audience and listen to the presenter, and if they were articulate, they could explain the problem, and they were able to present their research in a highly competent way. I would go up to them afterwards and hand them my card and say, hey, I run Spider Labs. I'm looking for someone just like you to fill a position I have. Are you interested? And sometimes they say, no, I'm not looking. And they pack up their stuff. And sure enough, sometimes a few weeks later, I would get a ping on LinkedIn, or I'd get an email from them, and they would come my way. But and sometimes these are very young. I mean, 21-year-olds. I actually hired an 18-year-old who just graduated high school, who I saw at a conference in London, and brought him on to join my team. But even thinking further on, so if you think about trying to help bring on folks who are like 18, 19 years old, I think even further. So I mentioned I've been in the cybersecurity space for 20 years. My experience goes well before that. I received my first computer when I was 6 in 1981 and taught myself the code. Sat down with the instruction book and the computer. It was a Timex Sinclair computer, plugged into my TV set. My parents are both non-technical. I had to figure it out myself. And thinking about how you bring that spark, get people over the wall to where it's not just learning about to code in Scratch. I have 2 small children who learned Scratch in grammar school. Very exciting, very interesting, but it doesn't teach them how computers work. It doesn't teach them the fundamentals that is needed in cybersecurity. And so thinking about that, even accelerating into high school or junior high, there's always a handful of computer geeks that exist in the school. There was when I was in high school. Myself and 2 other friends sat in a corner and wrote video games and hacked the high school network. And so there's always a few of those at every single school, but trying to figure out how you find all of those in schools, say, across the country, and bring them together on online contests or online forums, and try to bring them together to identify who those new and interesting folks will be that'll be the next generation of cybersecurity folks in our workforce, I think is extremely important.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Katie?
I'm Katie Masouras. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Luta Security. And basically what my company does is helps governments and large organizations prepare for the love that can only be described as helpful hackers, right? So one of the things that this crowd may know me for is I was the consultant who walked the Pentagon through their very first creation of their first bug bounty program called Hack the Pentagon. How many of you heard of it? How many of you participated? Okay, a few. All right, so that's great. At the time, you know, they just wanted to have a conversation with me because at the time, the first time I was invited to the Pentagon, it was because I had created Microsoft's first bug bounty programs. I was there as a strategist. But looking back at my history, I have about 20 years professional experience in computer security, hands-on, and I also got my first computer when I was a child. I was 8 years old, taught myself how to program. In fact, our stories are so much the same that we're practically the same person. I mean, you can tell. But you know, that kind of brings me to an element of, you know, in terms of recruiting. A lot of people look at me and they say, Katie, you're a woman, so tell us, how can we bring more women into it? And I'm like, I actually don't know, because I don't represent all women. I represent myself. And my background is pretty much identical to the guys that are in our profession right now. Lonely kid, in the corner, taught myself how to program, not many friends. Okay, maybe you had friends, but I did not.
I had 2.
And so, you know, perhaps recruiting young, diverse populations with no friends, you know, is perhaps an approach to take here. But here's the thing, you know, while you know, that was sort of the upbringing at the time, I have a younger sister. She's 8 years younger than me. And the difference in generation gaps technologically was huge, right? If you think about people who drove the first automobiles, the Model Ts, those things would break down. You'd have to actually know a bit about how the mechanics work. You'd have to be a bit of an automotive engineer, a mechanic, to drive a car. And that was us in the early days of computing before the internet had really taken place. We all had to know what was under that hood. My younger sister, while she was an intelligent person, went to Berkeley, majored in physics until she downgraded to classics. I don't know what that's about, but you know, very intelligent person, had no idea what was under the hood of her computer because she grew up with Windows. I grew up with BASIC and a Commodore 64. And so my first exposures to hacking were mostly cheating at games, you know, trying to outdo the scores in Tetris, which may or may not have been a conspiracy by an adversary to, you know, take our eyes off of real mathematical tasks and just have us do the little things with the blocks. That was the theory back then. But the thing was, you know, I just wanted to play games. I wanted to write games. I wanted to do the normal things that kids do. And actually, it turns out that's what kids still want to do with computers. Now, fast forward to building up a cybersecurity workforce now. One of the most inspiring things I saw as a result of Hack the Pentagon was when Secretary Ash Carter invited a high school student who had competed and, you know, received a bug bounty to come to the Pentagon and be recognized and rewarded. And I can't even imagine a world in which a teenage us were invited to the Pentagon, you know? I mean, in fact, an adult me invited to the Pentagon is still pretty fantastic. But
you can have it.
I will actually say, and I will say that I am not, you know, I was surprised to hear that there's only one person here in uniform. I, too, am in uniform, but of a different army. I'm like, you know, Imperator Cadiosa of the hacker army, pretty much, you know, and we definitely go with Chrome. So, but the thing is, the recruitment and the retention of people, I think, one, needs to start incredibly young. Those characteristics of boundless curiosity that you find in children that usually our education system tries to, let's just say, smooth out, you know, a lot of those rough edges. And then you've got the challenge from a military perspective. You need to have people who are capable of looking at the parameters of a system that they've been given and deliberately try and break the rules. So you need a whole bunch of rule-following rule breakers to stem up and shore up your ranks. And how are you going to do that? And how are you going to create this activity that is interesting for people who come from, you know, the different backgrounds and may or may not want to, you know, embrace the entire military culture. I myself, as I was trying to figure out how I was going to pay for college, which I didn't major in computer science because there weren't any really interesting jobs to me at the time. It was become a computer programmer, or, you know, I minored in mathematics, maybe go work for the NSA, but there weren't as interesting jobs at the time. So I majored in molecular biology. But how do you get these people to come in, major in the things that you want them to study, and then come into an organization? Well, when I heard about the direct commissioning, I thought that was quite an interesting idea. You know, in terms
Katie,
of,
you could be a colonel.
you know, as long as I get, you know, some kind of a uniform, that would be medals. Yeah.
I was telling
Exactly.
Katie earlier that my hair was actually pink until I cut it short.
And as was
Yeah.
mine.
All of them, actually. Yeah, we all had a bet of who was going to keep the pink hair, and yeah, clearly I won. But no, I think we want to get into the questions and everything and challenge the audience, but the last thing I'll say about it is, you know, it's not so much about having more people who are capable of doing this work. You start out with a population that is boundlessly curious. You have children. Children don't know the rules yet. Children children put peanut butter in the VCR. Children do all of these things and test the boundaries. That is what they're made for. And I think our challenge is really, how do we fit them into being productive members of society, joining our fight to defend, and not lose that ability to push all of those boundaries.
Okay, Katie, thank you. So I'm already giving ourselves high marks in the following respects. So Katie spoke about rule breaking. So we actually were trying to break some panel rules here. So you notice there was no PowerPoint. There was not long-winded dialogue. I also didn't go to a lot of trouble to introduce them because I felt like it would be best for you to hear from in their own voice. But I think we can all agree. I mean, we have a really very impressive lineup here. So Ed Sobies, I want to give a shout out to him. He helped pull this group together, and it's actually tremendously impressive. When I was thinking about this last night, I'm thinking, well, it's going to be a big crowd. Maybe you should be a little nervous. Well, there's no way we could fail. We have true thought leaders in this space that have, you know, decades of experience. So here we're going to continue the sort of on-panel thing, where I'm going to ask a question of the group, and then we'll just jump in whatever order we feel comfortable. I'm not going to, if you would. And then I will take the second question, will come from the audience. So be thinking about what one of you great folks will be asking this panel, this esteemed panel, in this area of workforce development, education, and training. So with that, I'm going to throw out a question that actually induced a fair amount of dialogue amongst the group, and it was, you know, for the cybersecurity workforce, that big mass of talent that we're trying to develop, you know, what should the areas of focus be, both in the educational settings, training settings, and in workforce development settings? So I'll welcome anyone on the panel to just weigh in.
Yes, I think what I've experienced and what I've seen in my role at Uptake, we have around 500 software engineers that work at our company. And I think the big thing that most people maybe don't understand is that being a software developer is very different than being someone who's good at cybersecurity. And I think what it comes down to is most of those folks went to school or they went to dev boot camps and they learned how to be Java developers or C developers. But they didn't learn about the underlying components within a computer and network and all the other pieces. So I think trying to focus on the basics, like you had mentioned with the wall, getting past the wall, trying to focus on the basics early on, even at university, having people build networks, having people understand how to build computers, how to understand how various technology works is extremely important. To build those cybersecurity capabilities. It's not just coding, it's not just programming. Even though in my background, I started out as a programmer, but I had to build my computers in order to start programming. It's very different today when you say, hey, you can just do this, you know, you can just touch around on a mobile device and write a program. We should have challenge the students and challenge the folks to actually have to build that computer before they can actually write that first line of code, or build that network before they can actually set up the web server that's going to serve up things.
I love that response, and I'm just going to jump in here and build off of it. So in my career trajectory, I started out molecular biologist, worked on the Human Genome Project. Then I was a systems administrator. AKA, I didn't want to be a molecular biologist anymore, and I still wanted a job, so I just changed jobs at the Genome Center at MIT. What that taught me was we built a capacity, a brand new center, so I got to learn speccing from power all the way up, networking, backups, everything, by building it. And this was, we were moving big data before big data was cool. This was the early 90s, and we were moving terabytes of data. So I mean, think about that on the scale of what we were doing. We were the first bioinformatics group. So it was practical development alongside building, an organization and infrastructure. And then fast forward, I was privileged to be a systems administrator at the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. So space, the final frontier, So talk about actually watching these systems be launched and go to another planet. And this was like the practical application. Now, as a security person, yes, of course, I'm interested in fixing the bugs and whatnot, but supporting the mission of what we were actually trying to do was key. And I think that people who learn security sort of isolated in a bubble without having that pragmatic experience of having to actually build and be responsible for a mission. I think there's a huge disconnect. It's a lot easier to teach a developer or a systems administrator more security than it is to teach a pure, quote unquote, pure security practitioner who has never had those operational responsibilities or development responsibilities the other way around. And so I look at it as technical empathy. You need to build technical empathy.
Pull both of those together.
Yeah.
So there's a guy named Joe Sullivan who is the chief security officer at Facebook when I worked with him, but he since moved to Uber as the chief security officer, and he told Rob Kanaki in the White House last year that he has stopped looking at whether or not people have cybersecurity degrees. That all he looks for is those essentials that they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And what you heard, the reason I want to jump in is both of them got it. But you also heard somebody didn't get it because she did Windows. Was that your sister or your
My
somebody?
younger sister, yeah.
So today we don't have the people getting it the way they got it.
Right.
So we actually have a smaller pipeline coming in of people who know the essentials because so many of us learned Windows rather than learned how the computer worked. And what those essentials are is anatomy. So for medicine, there's a body anatomy. Mm-hmm. They've said the words, but what was fascinating was when Rob told me what the guy at Facebook and now Uber said, he listed exactly what they were saying. It's how the computer works, anatomy, how Linux works, how Windows works internally, how to write one of them, P, which...
Python.
Python, sorry. And one more. Anyway, but their anatomy. Do you notice there's nothing that... She got it when she was a sysadmin. She didn't get it by being a security person. Yeah. And that's how you get over the wall. So if we are going to make people... I rail at one thing, which is I don't see how a person can become a policy person before she knows how to do the work. Because how the heck does she know what policy to make if she doesn't have a clue how the attacks work and how you defend them? But I get yelled at by 80% of audiences when I say that, so you can yell at me too. But if you decide that you want technical people running organizations and being available, then you don't start with cybersecurity. You start with being a sysadmin, which you can't anymore because there aren't enough jobs, or learning it by building your own computer, which you can't anymore because everybody buys a Chromebook. So the only way to do that is to teach those 5 essentials. And it turns out that's what that game teaches. And one of the other things she said, just pull it all together, young people have all this energy. So the UAE was the first place the game was built because they were building their own NSA. And they wanted a pipeline. And they had camps. They had 4,500 kids played the game. The top 500 scorers went to 10 camps. There were girl camps and boy camps. The girl camps, it was 14 to 17-year-olds. One of the 17-year-olds brought her 9-year-old sister, who was not invited, but her mom had something to do that week, and nobody was going to take care of her sister, so she showed up. Day 1, bored silly. Day 2, played with the game. Day 3, she was showing the older girls how to debug Python code. She'd never heard the word Python. It's that Brumley idea you discover by solving problems, and it's just wonderful to watch people who are young, who are interested, learn it. I'm done. Go ahead.
So actually, if I could put a couple, my personal bricks in the wall, right? If you want to be effective on a cyber protection team, 3 things. You better understand operating systems. You better understand networking.
Oh, that's the one I've done.
And then sequence selection and iteration, right? So where are all the IT 105 instructors and graduates, right? John Giordano, my course director, sitting back there with his hand raised high, right? You better understand the fundamentals of how to write code, sequence selection and iteration. Ed Sobieski is still handing me out tasks 12 years later, by the way, when he asked me to join the panel. But that's the educational foundation, right? You have to understand operating systems. If you don't understand how the file system communicates back to the operating system, then you can't attack it, nor can you defend it. If you don't understand how the systems are connected and you can't look at a routing table and determine how packets are moving through the network, then you can't defend that network. And if you can't defend the host and the network, then you're not useful to me on a cyber protection team. We need that. And, by the way, because you're going to run into something that you've never seen before, you better be able to script. And you better be able to write the code that's going to design some new component that is going to be able to put those pieces together. That's the educational foundation. But now how do you train? It's one thing to be really good as a host analyst, really good as a network analyst, but we need leaders that can pull that team together and move them towards that common mission, right? Towards that common objective. Guess what the Army's really good at, right? I mean, the Army's been doing this for a while in terms of understanding what it means to lead and then actually leading and training towards meeting those objectives. What we do in the cyber world in terms of our Army training and the execution of Army operations is no different than it is in any other domain that the Army fights in. It's a little more technical, but it's fundamentally no different. But as we build that training environment, we need to be operating our weapons platforms with our tools on our networks in support of our organizations, none of which you can do if you haven't gotten over the wall. The wall, that foundation, that educational foundation is just that, foundational. But in and of itself is not sufficient to go forward and prosecute conflict in support of the military organizations. You must then train because you have to be able to pull units together, organizations, individuals together towards a common objective.
If I could use my moderator's prerogative just to weigh in, certainly we heard the value of understanding how it works. And like I said, we talked at length in the panel. We want to make sure there was somewhat of a hopeful message because there is a lot of hope. There is, we're not lost. We are not lost and we're not necessarily losing all the ground. And one of the things that should give us hope is there's so many opportunities to do exactly this. And in part that's technologically driven. Back in the, the late 90s or so when some of us got into this business, there really was not a lot of places where you could practice this craft and really understand at a deep level how systems work. If you're really motivated, you could buy your own computer and build it. But now we're in a place where there's a tremendous amount of resources available for folks to do hands-on, whether it's taking advantage of just virtualization as a technology in itself, or the availability of ranges and competitions and training opportunities, most of which are free, but there's many, many opportunities. So we find ourselves in a place where there is great opportunities to learn in depth and then use that knowledge to help protect and defend systems. And one part of this question we didn't get into is like, where would you focus? So we heard a lot about technology here. And I think as a group we came to a consensus that if there's real potential to make a leap ahead, we can't forget about the human dimensional sides of this. So there is policy innovation that could be brought to bear. There's economic innovation that could be brought to bear. There's behavioral science that should be brought into this space. But Alan's point is very well taken. You can't very well expect people in those disciplines to make substantive contributions unless they have at least a foundation of knowledge. And I'm proud of one of the things we did early on in West when we developed a course that was a policy for cyber war. And we put technologists and policy folks in the same room. And what we believe we accomplished even then and can still be accomplished in the present day is true policy innovation. So we don't think of innovation, we think of policy, we think of technology innovation. But if we put policymakers into the research labs, So I'm speaking now from a large research institution like Texas A&M, where they can not only understand the technologies better, but could actually influence the early design. Now think of this. This is really a groundbreaking idea. Get policy writers involved, get behavioral science involved in the development of these capabilities. It will influence the design, but even better, when they come out of at the end of the assembly line and they're now fully formed capabilities, we now have policymakers, those graduates that will go into be congressional staffers, for example, that understand the technology so we could get ahead of it instead of being years behind as we've seen in the past.
So I will say that would definitely help. But one of the biggest problems that we've been wrestling with for our entire professional careers in security, and it's just getting worse, is the economies of scale that we're dealing with. So you can embed policy people in a technical lab environment, but one of the reasons why I actually volunteered to join Microsoft as a hacker, I actually went and said, yes, I will join you as a strategist, was because there were scale problems that I would not see any other way. There were experiences I couldn't get any other way. And I think that there's a big problem in policymakers, not just lacking some technical fundamentals, but policymakers and even a lot of our technical brothers and sisters out there who lack the ability to think on a large scale. What would work in the early 2000s in terms of best practices and defenses are simply not scaling right now. And so I think as a policy, when I see things like, saying that, oh, well, all IoT purchases of the United States government should have no known vulnerabilities in it, that sounds fantastic. It sounds really good. And then you start getting into the idea of polling for known vulnerabilities. And you may end up, because of a scale issue, this very well-intentioned bill that sounds great, but there is literally no way to do it at scale. You will either be polling for vulnerabilities constantly or filing for exceptions for the vulnerabilities you know about constantly. And has anything actually changed? So I worry when I see the let's embed and let's cross-pollinate. The cross-pollination is important, but it's not happening around scale problems. And that's where we are right now.
Okay. Well, good. So somebody has, I think, hacked the clock. I have no idea. What does that clock tell you?
The clock has been changing times.
It's at least 25 minutes wrong.
Okay, so we're confused
It's a
about the clock. But
countdown
having
clock.
said that,
Time is
now
it?
we have plenty of hands up, which so we're going to go all the way to the back because I see a hand up there. So right, all the way in the back corner. Is there a microphone that we could bring? Okay, excellent. So there's no shortage of questions for this esteemed body.
Thank you. Great panel, great discussion. So I have a question and a concern, particularly to you, Mr. Pollard. When you start talking about testing and determining who really belongs in the field, we really haven't gotten to a place where the digital divide is closed. So, I mean, I can look around the room now, and there's not many of me, so I think about women and people of color. How are we accessing the kids at what level? Elementary school. You talk about having computers at 8 and putting it together. The digital divide, it gets to that most basic aspect of access, right? So when we start talking about access at the most basic level, I'm very interested in your thoughts about making sure that accessibility is there, 1. 2, who's creating these tests? I think that we've seen, and I definitely plan to research and look at the tests that you referred to, their process, et cetera, because I'm very curious. When I think of tests and standardized tests, I think of bias. I think of who's creating them. I think of the outcome is determined by whoever's created them and what the metrics are. And again, I start thinking about diversity and looking around the room. And when we start talking about exclusion, I get really nervous because that just seems to be taking steps towards furthering the divide. So I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts about that. And in particular, when you think of artificial intelligence, autonomy, systems being created in that way
Let's do the first 2 and then we'll do the rest of them. Okay. So the best 3 intrusion detection analysts, the best 2 intrusion detection analysts I have ever known were Vicki Irwin and Judy Novak. And the best overall cybersecurity architect who trained John Stewart and all the big names was named Michelle Gill. So the fact that this room has about 12 women in it or 15 women in it is all our fault. And it happened because, not all SANS, but all our field's fault, although I think we take some of the guilt too. But it turns out, this comes from Ruth Farmer, who ran this program in the White House last year and set up all the women network, women in technology kind of program. She says women in general don't think they will do as well as they will, and men in general think they will do better than they will. And so if you build any kind of open competition, women will say, oh, I don't want to do that. So the first thing we're doing, this summer program with 7 governors was very successful, except it had about 4 or 5% women in it. So in February, the nation is going to be running the first Women's CyberStart program. The only people who can play are women. So we don't have any sense of I have to compete with other people. The women's schools who got the highest scores on Cyber Patriot are co-sponsoring it with us, so all the women's Cyber Patriot teams are in it. So it's a let's go to the people who we're missing and make it easy for them to show that their skills are good, but they still have to do well on the game. I got this from one of the best women in the field, said, stop giving everybody a chance. Give people a chance if they prove they can do it. We'll never solve this problem if we try to train everybody in everything. But on minority stuff, we're working with the nuclear energy labs, who have great programs with minority colleges. We haven't figured out how to do the high schools and junior highs yet, but we will within the next few months. So I don't want to make it an open competition and say, you're invited too. I want to focus on those groups and make sure we do everything we can to get the maximum number of highly skilled people in each of the underrepresented groups, and we'll do that. We will actually do that.
So I'll also I'll throw out a challenge to everybody in the room, and many of you are already doing this, but I want to throw the gauntlet down and challenge you nonetheless. Now, we're all busy, but between now and the start of the holidays, find some way to go to an elementary school, a middle school, a high school, a club, and influence. The people that can change this are sitting in this room. So, you know, when I'm down at Fort Gordon, Georgia, and Richmond County, Georgia, is not the model of affluence. And you look at some of the school systems, and they absolutely suffer from the digital divide. Absolutely. But how are they going to get over that? Well, they get over that through a little degree of innovation, where you partner with Augusta University and you build a virtualized internet accessible environment with which they can participate in some of these games and competitions without the requirement of building a lab within their school, which they cannot afford. But those sorts of innovative ways of getting out and reaching the youth, the only people that are going to do it, the only people that have the skills to do it are us. And so my challenge is between 2 months. In the next 2 months, every one of us, find a way to get out to an elementary school, middle school, a high school, a club, some way of reaching the youth, because until we hook them to write their first program in BASIC on I had an Apple IIc, by the way. It was so on their Apple IIc.
We can fight later.
Until you get them to do that and hook them, then we're going to be constantly fighting this battle of scale that we suffer for in human capital.
So I gotta actually weigh in as the only female and minority on this panel about recruiting females and minorities. So I am half Native Pacific Islander. I actually named my company Luta after the Native Chamorro name of the island where my mother was born. So yes, I am about as minority female as you can get in terms of having my own company and pulling through pretty much sheer force of will, staying in this industry as long as I have. And I've definitely seen an arc of female majors in computer science go to a peak and then start dropping. Also, I think the really big thing is, as much as we focus on this pipeline issue of getting more women and minorities interested and whatnot at the early learning levels, that's not the place where I think we need to act quite urgently in this industry. If we want more diversity, we actually have to act on keeping and promoting the higher level female and minorities that we have. And the issue here is I keep seeing folks spill out of our industry, this leaky pipeline, because I'm seeing women and minorities do equal or greater work and not see the same kinds of promotion. So when you're at the ground level and your hands are on the keyboard and there's no gender bit or race bit set on any packet that I've ever seen, you can do that meritocracy level stuff where people are competing at that very technical level behind the keyboard. But when you get into the higher leadership positions and you abstract away some of that technical baseline where everyone was going to be equal, that's where we see a real big breakdown. So the challenge to this room is to look at the places in your organizations and just do some statistical analysis. Figure out, is it actually the bottom that we're missing a lot of this diversity? Yes, we can do better there, but how is it dropping off as you're going up in the ranks? Because we are not going to be able to backfill that if the rate at which minorities and women are promoted do not go up commensurate with their skills and their experience. And that's what I've seen.
Trying to ask questions.
Okay.
All right, thanks. So one other lady in the room.
So we have,
what I'm
we have
talking about.
a question here in the front. He should seem to be, yes.
All right. So my name's Colonel Pat Duggan. My name's, first of all, thank you all very much for your time. I find this stuff fascinating. My name's Colonel Pat Duggan. I'm a neophyte to all this stuff. I don't really understand much of it. But after hearing the Chief of Staff of the Army's comments, from a military optic, are we institutionally conflating cybersecurity skill sets with cyber warfare skill sets? And by default, does that mean that if you're a cyber expert who wages cybersecurity, does that automatically make you a cyber warrior that wages cyber warfare? Do those same established models in the outside, is that the models that we need for asymmetric application in cyber warfare? So again, the question is, are we in danger of institutionally over-investing in cybersecurity models instead of cyber warfare models?
So I'll take the first stab at it, and I think that as an operational domain and as a community, we're guilty of conflating many terms. Cybersecurity and cyber warriors being two potential examples. I'll drill it all the way back to I'm going to steal the wall, by the way. The wall and the foundation, right? We need folks that understand operating systems, networking, and how to write code. If you can do those things, then you can prosecute offensive operations and defensive operations. And in fact, there absolutely should be a transition period where if you have been defending, you should look at what it means to be to operate on the offensive side and vice versa. If you know how to hack an operating system, then the likelihood that you know how to establish an effective defense is probably much greater, and vice versa. It works in the opposite side. So I think we boil it down to those foundational components, and then what we actually train you, so this is the difference between education and training, right? What we actually train you to do then can be very specific and tailored to meet an operational, potentially forward in combat mission. So I think, again, foundation, and then we can offer the necessary specialized training for you to perform, whether it is a always-on perimeter defense cybersecurity task, whether it is a terrain and enemy-focused cyber defensive task, or whether it is, can I exploit a system offensive cyber task.
If I could, I'm sorry, Katie, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of the training that I used to do when I was a professional penetration tester and doing the offensive side was training folks who were on the defense side who were not effectively applying all of the defense in-depth tools that they could to defend against someone like me. And in operational environments that we have in basically the broad, writ large infrastructure of the United States, we are more dependent on technology than probably almost any other country, and we actually, in order to succeed in a warfare capacity, we have to get our defense basics right. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to actually train the defenders on offense to really bring it home to them, because I never met a systems administrator like before they had ever run, you know, an offense security tool, and after, who viewed their defensive role the same way?
Nick, please.
Yeah, so in thinking about that, so I've run different teams that do offense and do defense, and today I have a cybersecurity team within Uptake that we defend Uptake from attacks. I also have an offensive team that hacks us on a regular basis. And I can say when it comes down to it, though, the skill sets are very different. Right, the skill sets and the techniques are very different, and like it's almost like you get down to who the person is, their mindset, their capabilities to really pull together the right team. You know, in my world, I have risk and compliance folks, I have you know, cloud operation folks from a security standpoint, I have incident responders, and I have a red team. I would not say, okay, red team, you're going to handle risk and compliance for the next 2 months. We probably wouldn't pass our audit.
Right.
There's a different mindset. The same regard, I would not take my firewall folks and say, now your job is to find all the security holes in our environment for the next 3 months. You know, it's the thoroughness that's needed for risk and compliance and security operations and all of that is different than the offensive mindset. You know, offensive mindset, I can toss a new piece of technology at them. They're like jackals, right? They try to rip it apart. The defensive folks would want to flip through the manual very slowly and read and understand and take notes. And so, in my mindset, you know, where I'm coming from is that, yes, I think, you know, there is a difference, and you could cross train. And I think there's value in defensive folks learning what the offense is like. But at the end of the day, identifying who the right people are for those jobs is extremely important, because they are different, very different skill sets. Even though it's all called cybersecurity, there are different skill sets within that field.
And I think that's one of the themes in some of our discussion leading into this. And I just, Paul Stanton and I both were infantry officers at one time before we assumed our current roles. And they don't have defensive and offensive infantry platoons, right? And for good reason, because there's capabilities, and those capabilities could be used for offensive and defensive purposes. So I have always advocated for, wherever possible, make sure that those that are going to be doing defense, and I actually like to think of it in terms of defensive cyber operations. That's a thing, and it's not just incident response. It's not just calling up the fire department, because I don't think that's the right analogy. I think it is conducting a defensive cyber operation, and
it absolutely is, sir. By the way,
exactly.
As one responsible for executing, it is defensive cyber operations, which in military vernacular constitutes maneuver. We maneuver in defensive space in cyberspace in order to perform defensive missions.
Right.
Didn't mean to interrupt you, sir.
No, not at all. Please, that's what we were supposed to do.
We agreed.
So good on you. So, in short, I think that if you have a solely defensive mindset, you got to almost a Maginot Line sort of a mentality that I think we can all agree is unhelpful in this space. That while people have different skill sets, and when you build these teams, you draw upon those that have specific skills to build the right teams, but that it is healthy and valuable and helps them develop the knowledge and skills and abilities they need in their jobs for even defensive cyber operators to, from time to time, engage in and explore with and actually do offensive cyber activities. Okay, so we have another question here, please.
There's one in the back with the.
Hi, my name is Conrad Hawk. I'm a cadet at Texas A&M University. I got a question.
Wait, I don't think anybody can hear you. Can you let the person with the mic come and help you?
And then I think we have to give the person in the back a turn, because
very
that was
good.
supposed to
Okay.
be the person.
My apologies. It's hard to
Well,
say.
our clock reset again, so we have an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah,
we have plenty of time.
We got all the time in the world.
It stopped. Right. We have an unlimited
now the
amount of
clock
time
is
now.
stopped.
Go ahead.
Somebody who has hacked this clock. Who is conducting an offensive cyber operation right now on this clock?
Not it.
Please.
It wasn't me.
Is this on? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
So my name is Conrad Hawk. I'm a graduate student. I'm a cadet at Texas A&M University. So I'm trying to be one of these cyber policy analysts that you guys keep speaking don't have the technical background. So at what point do you pull us graduate policy major types to bridge the technical gap to fill the essentials-based pipeline?
I can try that. It turns out it's not rocket science. So it's not something that only a few people are good enough to do at all. And I think the colleges, as soon as Joe Sullivan's comments get out to the rest of the CISOs, who have all will reflect that most of their good people have those essentials and the other ones don't. Employers will say, I really can't take you unless you have those basic skills. The UK has just started a program called Her Majesty's Government's Cyber Schools Program. It'll start in 2 weeks. It was announced in June. It has the game, but then it has an online course on the essentials. And the better part of it, it has a test that says, did you in fact, not a yes-no test, but to what degree have you mastered each of the essentials? So I think that once that thing comes over the US, which will probably be May or June, I think most of the colleges, as employers start pushing and saying, I really would like you guys to have that, they'll make it available to the students at their school. So I would guess the Texas A&M won't change all its programming and all its courses because that takes a century?
No.
Okay.
Actually, half a century.
Half a century. Yes. But they'll do it as a kind of an extracurricular activity for people who want to be policy people, but no, they really don't deserve it if they don't know how the patient's body works. They shouldn't be a doctor at all. Does that make sense? So at Texas A&M is the answer to your question, probably not outside.
Well, so I'll layer on top too, and that there are many positions within the Cyber Protection Brigade that are not on cyber protection teams. Notably, we have a lawyer. I need him to be a really good lawyer because I don't want to get arrested and thrown into jail. That being said, I need him to be motivated. I need him to explore. I actually require him to sit in all of our after-action reviews and in all of our operational updates so that he is intimately familiar with what we're doing operationally and is learning. He didn't come to us as a, quote, cyber lawyer, but he's learning cyber as he goes. And so I think it's the added bit of emphasis and recognition that, you know what, if I don't understand this space sufficiently, it's on me to figure that out, because if I'm going to be making policy decisions, if I'm going to be adjudicating legal matters, then I should probably understand the technology that's involved.
I will say that lawyers are definitely among my favorite non-traditionally technical people to work with, because a good lawyer, like a good coder, is very logical, and I can deal with that. There's a lingua franca in there. But I am one of those technologists that converted into working on policy because I thought it was so important. And one of the things I've observed, so I'm one of the members of the U.S. delegation renegotiating the Wassenaar arrangement, right? So renegotiating those problematic bits that were deemed to be, a little bit overscoped, right? And essentially, it comes down to when you're sitting there in the room renegotiating these bits, it is all about getting to a functional understanding of what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and then trying to craft the words to make it work. And that it speaks back to that sort of technical empathy I was talking about earlier. That was sort of building it across technical disciplines. I think I call them daywalkers. I want more daywalkers, half human, half vampire, half technologist, half policy person who has some practical experience embedded in some large-scale organization. And I say large-scale because you can get some practical technical experience if you work at some little startup, and you will be hands-on, knee-deep in something, and you can do some policy work and say that, yep, I dealt with incidents, I dealt with this and that. But on a small scale, you are not equipped to deal with policy writ large. So I would say intern in an organization that will absorb, a person and show you and demonstrate some of the technological scale problems that you as a policy person can then go contribute something meaningful and workable for the two communities.
Yeah, and just one quick wrap up, and then we'll get the question back here, is that these two-headed beasts can exist, and I think we have to.
I'm a two-headed beast.
That people with sufficient technical knowledge, not every policymaker either has the interest, the proclivity, the innate abilities to acquire the knowledge they did, but many of them do. Not every behavioral scientist should be in the tent, but we need some of them. Mm-hmm. Not every economist needs to be in the tent, but we need some of them. And they can make a difference. And if I can make a strong case for including even engineers, we hear increasingly that every system that was going to be built for the foreseeable future, they're going to prepend the word smart in front of, right? And when we hear smart, what word should we substitute for it? How about hackable? right? So wouldn't it be good to have a program where we could take an engineer from an ABET accredited program at any institution across the country, and they're going to build that smart bridge. But wouldn't it be great to give them, some of them, additional knowledge, cybersecurity expertise that they can overlay on their knowledge about how to build that next smart bridge, because this is going to happen. And then as that design is being formulated and developed, they can bring to that discussion and that process some knowledge of cybersecurity. To me, that two-headed beast is one we also have to create. So it's not just on the human dimensional side. Cybersecurity expertise is something that needs to be promulgated throughout all of our education, throughout all of our workforce development. It's not the only thing, and we have a bias. Certainly, that's obvious, very obvious. Okay, so with that, we'll take our question in the back. We go all the way in the back, please.
So you guys have talked a lot about different silos of operations, offensive versus defensive, et cetera, different problems that need to be tackled, like getting over the wall. But I think there's another dimension that we haven't talked about, and this was alluded to a little bit by somebody in the audience, which is the difference between, say, the cyber workforce, as the panel is titled, versus, say, cyber warfare. The traditional cyber workforce wouldn't be doing offensive things unless you support hackback, but the Army or the military cyber workforce would, which you could argue is cyber warfare. So going back to the keynote that David Brumley talked about with autonomous defense and autonomous offense, there's a certain level that you get to. When you teach people, you can teach people to, say, using Bloom's taxonomy as an example, the applying level, but how do you get to the creating level? And you can train a workforce and you can spin up people that know how to apply what you've taught them. But how do you get them deeper than that? And do we need to be deeper than that? Because from the warfare perspective...
But David answered that question.
Well, but from
he said they become creative after they've learned how to solve the simpler problems.
Yeah, but he's not training the workforce. He's training a different breed. So hold on one sec on that. So on the warfare...
You want to come up... I mean...
No. So on the warfare side... The point here is the adversaries are on the creating side. And if we're not there as well for a large majority, then we're going to be behind.
But
so I think
they started out with the basics. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a premise there that I would argue with, which is cyber workforce doesn't do cyber warfare-like activities. Red teams within the cyber workforce are an absolutely essential part of a traditional non-military cyber workforce. So there are absolutely attack capabilities running complex campaigns, much like a nation state kind of campaign. And that all occurs in the advanced levels of a cyber workforce, like Nick has built at his company and companies before, like many other private companies have built and financial institutions, et cetera. And this has nothing to do with hackback. It's nothing to do with doing offense against an adversary. It's all about actually modeling the adversary against yourself when you are yourself a nation-state level target. So we do have to build those capabilities in the existing private and public sector workforce, cyber workforce. So that was one premise I kind of wanted to address in that way.
Okay, we're going to have just one more question because then we'll each of us get a 1 minute kind of wrap up, just out of, if we could. So please, there's a question I believe over here.
Quick question here. So we've heard a lot of conversation about cyber workforce and changing at the hands-on keyboard level what that workforce looks like. From the keynote this morning, specifically addressed to those under the age of 30, to going up to the discussion about promotions and promoting people. When are we going to see leadership level changes to put those young professionals into leadership positions? So when are we going to have in the Army a 25-year-old as a 3-star or cyber command run by a 30-year-old?
So, as a member of two professions, I'm the member of the Army profession first, and then I'm a member of a technical profession second. But everybody that is within the Cyber Protection Brigade and within the cyber force writ large for the Army is charged with being a member of two professions. You must be in the Army and you must be a technical professional. And both of those come with overhead in terms of education, training, and then ultimately responsibilities. But you don't laterally become a 3-star general. You don't laterally become a colonel in the Army. There are many professional gates that you go through in order to understand the prosecution of warfare before you're charged with being responsible for it. We are now, I will admit, we are in the early stages of identifying those leadership tasks for our cyber mission force, but it's absolutely, my brother in arms, Dave Branch, who commands the 780th Military Intelligence Brigade, and I are working towards what does it mean to be an NCO in the cyber mission force, non-commissioned officer, charged with responsibilities of leading your team. What does it mean to be a lieutenant? And that's where it starts, because you don't automatically jump to higher echelons of command and responsibility. You progress towards them with going through the crucibles of leadership that are necessary. I will admit that the gates from which to progress as an infantry officer are very well understood and very well documented, and any infantry officer in the room would be able to say, I know exactly what I should be doing next in order to progress to becoming a battalion commander, a brigade commander, or ultimately a general officer. It's not as crystal clear for the cyber force, but we are pushing our leaders into those positions now. One of my principal talking points when offered the opportunity to talk to our junior officers is if you think that you're going to be in a blue lit room with Red Bull and Cheetos writing code, wrong. You are a member of the Army profession, and you're a technical professional. You are charged with leadership. And if you don't think it's highly technical to lead technical teams, then you are sorely mistaken. You get pushed to the edge of your educational understanding as you lead increasingly large teams that are responsible for increasingly complex objectives and mission sets. But that process of developing those leaders is absolutely at the forefront and requirements that we're driving today.
And just one follow-up to that. So the day when you're going to hear lots of general officers say, you know, I don't really know anything about this cyber stuff, are going to be in the past for the most part. And it's with not just a little bit of pride. We began something back in the late 90s in the Army where we focused on this. And you're seeing the fruits right here on this stage. So Paul Stanton was a young captain when he first came into the program. And he has grown and developed, and he is that deeply technical and very effective leader as a member of the force and as a member of the technology community. So we're there now, and we have much, much to learn. But the cyber mission forces we see are well led, and they're led by individuals that have deep technical knowledge so that they can be competent and they can effectively lead those organizations. And I would say, and it's not just the Army, I would say the Department of Defense in particular, we have focused on this for now the better part of the last 2 decades, such that now we have senior leaders commanding brigades and ultimately, and you heard General Nakasone. He clearly is not a knucklehead, right? He knows his way around in this space, and he's a very effective strategic leader. So do we have all the answers? No. Have we made tremendous progress? Absolutely. Do we have a lot of room for additional improvement? Certainly. And you know, we welcome continued engagement with this community as we move forward. So as I promised the group, I'm going to give us each a minute, so we'll go in reverse order now. So Katie, please, we'll let you kick it off.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for bringing this panel together. I think it was an interesting discussion. I'm always amazed at rooms that want to hear from me, such as I am. I think that bringing the themes together here, we're looking at not just an increase in the recruiting at the basic and entry levels at those younger ages, but we really need to focus on how do we build beyond the technical capabilities into the leadership capabilities, and not just who are willing to get that haircut, but those who who want to be able to serve with this haircut, right? And be able to dovetail those populations together, working together as much as possible, and being open to new ways of engaging each other. I mean, certainly Hack the Pentagon was one of those moments that I've really thought I forked into another dimension, like an alternate universe in which that occurred. I think we have a choice going forward about how we recruit and what our conscious decisions are about what we want the cyber workforce to look like, what kinds of skills we need to bear in terms of offense and defense, and what do we really mean by diversity if it's just surface traits versus diversity of approach and academic disciplines. And I think that's where we are right now.
Okay, good. Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, so I think if we say we set a goal of 15 years from now, we want to be, the world leaders in cyber capabilities. The folks that are going to be the 21-year-olds in 15 years are only 6 years old today. And so, trying to think of ways we can influence. So if there's folks in this room that can influence sort of the education curriculums beyond just learning, how to just code on an iPad, but influence down to a level of learning the basics of the networking, the operating systems. There are 6-year-olds that can learn that. You don't have to wait till they're in junior high or high school or college to learn those capabilities. And if we can find those 5, 6 students at every school in the United States, we would have a massive workforce come 15 years from now.
Thank you, Nick. Alan, please.
2 things. One, I talked about a lot of systems and things going on in other countries. If you want the data on any of those, my email is apaller@sans.org, APALLER@sans.org. So if you say, what did you say about that, I'm happy
With
to
the throat
answer.
clearing, so it's A.
Yeah,
Okay.
Okay. 2, I believe you will find, I briefed the Senate staffers yesterday, and I made a claim, and I don't know if they'll carry through, but I think they will. I believe we can solve what we call the cybersecurity manpower problem in the United States in the next 36 months. It doesn't take longer than that. You don't need to spend longer than that. You can spend the rest of your life admiring the problem. But right now we have in place, those governors ran a program, and it'll be a governor-led program. The U.S. doesn't do anything nationally, except in the military, which might be a better home for it. But it'll probably be a governor-led program. The states will solve the manpower problem quickly. You'll see that, the announcements, all through the next few months. And my sense is this thing we call the shortage will be very much the operational people, because you're training the people to do offense and defense. That'll still be hard and long. But the people you want to train, I don't think we're going to have any more trouble in 3 years having enough people flowing through the pipeline. The real problem will be getting rid of the people that we already hired who don't know anything and who think they do.
Yeah. Okay. Paul, please. Thank you, Alan.
I have to stop laughing because that's absolutely true, by the way. So I think that as far as the workforce goes, what do we bring to the fight? We bring what is enticing to many of those like us. And that's a really challenging mission and a hard problem. Most of us are motivated by solving that hard problem. We've got plenty of them. Arguably, being in the very early stages of building a cyber force, speaking specifically from within the Army, all the resources don't fall at our feet, right? It's pretty challenging to develop, to have the environment to support development, to support training. We're working very, very hard and as quickly as possible to create that environment. But don't let that stop you, right? If you're in uniform sitting out there, especially if you're in the Cyber Protection Brigade, figure out how to breach or bypass. Get beyond that obstacle that says, you know what, there's no doctrine that tells me how to fight this fight. Well, okay, fine. Go figure out how to solve it, and then help train the subordinates that are in your organization how to solve it. And don't let the absence of resources or the obstacles stop you, because we are all motivated by solving that hard problem.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to ask my panelists to stand up, please. On your feet. There we go. So that's for you.
It's amazing how you had like a microphone
Very
and
cool.
a
Very
camera
good.
in this thing.
Okay. So I can't be happier with the way the panel turned out. Thank you for your participation. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Nice job. Nicely done.